Hello and welcome to our podcast through the University of Kansas Medical Center. My name is Angela Carrasco, and joining us today, we have Dr. Jon Brumberg, Assistant Professor in the Department of Speech, Language, Hearing, Sciences, and Disorders at the University of Kansas. Dr. Brumberg also directs the Speech and Applied Neuroscience Lab. Thank you for joining us today, Jon.
Thanks for having me. I'm pretty excited to be here.
You bet. So in reading your bio, you have a bit of a different background than our typical faculty members who come in with degrees in speech-language pathology or audiology. Could you tell us about your education and the path that led you to KU?
Sure. So I started out as an undergraduate in computer engineering and decided I want to do a little bit more than just engineering stuff. And so I switched to computer science, which doesn't seem like it's a huge shift, but what that led me to do was do another major in philosophy as well. So I have a bachelor's in computer science, a bachelor's in philosophy, and they really informed my ideas about cognition, artificial intelligence. And so after that, I finished my computer science degree in philosophy and started working in psychology in a visual psychophysics lab. So in the visual psychophysics lab, I was actually working on things like visual illusions. Okay. So things like where you can see a square, but a square isn't actually there.
Okay.
And I wanted to try to figure out, from my computer science background, is it possible to create a program that would mimic your brain so that we didn't have to do experiments with people anymore?
Okay.
Turns out that was a really hard problem, but there was a graduate program where I did my graduate degree at Boston University that did exactly that stuff. So I was pretty much going to be a neuroscientist who studied vision until I got to grad school and I discovered speech motor control. And that's kind of how I got to where I am today. In speech motor control, we were trying to understand how your brain coordinates itself, how it directs all the muscles of the speech mechanism to do what we know as fluent speech production. And I was very fortunate in that graduate degree to be involved in a project where we were analyzing data from human participants who needed to have electrode recordings from their brain during surgeries or something like that to analyze exactly how speech is represented in their brains. And then we flipped that on its head and said, well, if we know what's happening in your brain while you're speaking, can we use that information to help people who are paralyzed communicate again? And so that's really how I got to where I am, was through this neuroscience, computational science of speech motor control for creating new communication devices for people who are paralyzed.
Wow. So was that normal to go through and learn about speech in your neuroscience program? I mean, how did you end up sliding into speech?
Right. So a lot of neuroscience is heavily based in vision. That's kind of where the earliest neuroscience came from. And motor control is definitely a subset of that. Speech motor control is even more of a subset. It's a very small field where we all really know each other. So it wasn't necessarily common, but where I was, my PhD mentor had developed a really very well-known now neurocomputational model of speech production. And so I was really in the right place at the right time to be able to do this, because this is a really well-known model in the field, and it was really well-known at Boston University where I did my graduate degree. So yeah, it was a little bit uncommon, but all of the people that I know now kind of did something similar, where they were into neuroscience and added on the speech motor control, or were interested in speech motor control and then did a neuroscience.
So when you applied to KU, were they looking for a position in that, or is it something where you applied and they said, wow, we actually could use that here?
It was a little bit of both. The year that I applied, there was a need for some speech production, some speech motor control. What certainly happened the year that I applied was that there was a push to be a little bit more interdisciplinary and a little bit more technologically based. And all of my work, so the work is on brain-computer interface for restoring communication. As you might imagine, that's a hugely interdisciplinary field. It involves computer science, speech, engineering, and of course is very technologically based. We consider in our lab to be a very advanced form of augmentative and alternative communication, which is in itself has a very high-tech component to it. So it's very technologically based and interdisciplinary, which sort of fit the needs and directions of the department at that time.
Absolutely. You are the director of the Speech and Applied Neuroscience Lab. Could you explain what type of research you're doing in your lab? It sounds like you've kind of touched on that a little bit already.
Yeah, so in the lab we have three major sort of philosophies on our research. The one is to better understand how your brain processes speech, particularly for production and motor control, what kind of technology we can develop that can be used to enable someone who is no longer able to communicate due to like a disease or injury, so things like ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease or strokes or particularly brainstem strokes, and then translating that into clinical practice. And so understanding how our devices are being used by individuals who need them, as well as clinical providers, caretakers, communication partners of individuals who are using these devices. Broadly, these are brain-computer interfaces, and we really focus on two ends of the spectrum. One is a brain-computer interface that can act as an access device for existing clinical and commercial devices for augmentative and alternative communication.
Like iPads?
Like iPads, exactly. And iPads are the new big thing. You can get all sorts of apps. There's a good way of choosing an app to use for communication, but then there are also specific developers of these technologies that have had decades of research and decades of clinical and commercial experience. So it's a combination of those two things. And then the other end, so that's like the translational end of how can we get our technology out into the public as soon as possible using the resources that are already available, both from a clinical standpoint, so through clinical training of master students, and from a commercial standpoint, from people who develop apps and the technology itself. On the other end is the more futuristic, high sci-fi sort of end of, well, if we can do all this stuff, maybe we can create an artificial vocal tract and have it speak for you. And
Wow.
it's not mind reading, right? It's not thought reading, but it is converting your motor activity into something that can control a simulation of your vocal tract.
So like what we've heard with Stephen Hawking's, right? With the
Yeah, so that's actually part of the first one. So Stephen Hawking, what he used was an augmentative alternative communication device. He's used different access methods throughout his life as his motor ability has shifted and changed. Common access technologies now include eye gaze. You can do something as simple as pressing a switch if you can do that. Some people have to use sort of like an infrared scanner to see that movement, or a proximity sensor to see that movement. What we work with are people who can't even do that. And so we say, is there a brain signal that we can observe, whether it's due to some sort of visual stimulus, an auditory stimulus, or cognitive or motor behavioral state change, and use that to activate a virtual switch to communicate over one of those commercial devices.
Wow. So this sounds very high-tech and expensive. And I know when you're trying to get grant dollars, it's hard to come by to always get the amount of money that you need. So with you talking about this interdisciplinary work, do you basically find yourself collaborating with others and trying to maybe use some of their technological assets that they already have in order to help with what you're doing?
Yes. What I can say is, yes, we absolutely collaborate. All of my research is collaborative. The more high-tech stuff that we do, where we're actually working with surgeons and neurologists and patients who are undergoing some pretty severe medical treatments but have volunteered to be a part of research studies, that's absolutely a collaborative effort. All of our technology development sometimes is homegrown. So I have a computer science undergraduate degree. I've been programming for a really long time now,
Awesome.
over like 25 years, I guess,
Wow.
of programming in different languages. And I'm the major programmer in our lab. I have undergrads and graduate students who do some programming, but a lot of the technology has been developed over the course of just our research in the lab. But in order to make that technology accessible, I'm not a clinician, so that does make me a little bit of an outlier in departments like ours, although our department is actually rather interdisciplinary in that way. So I don't necessarily have the clinical background to understand what will be useful and what won't be useful, but that's where our clinical collaborators come in, that's where our clinical graduate students come in, and other faculty in our department to help shepherd that translation, or at least understand what features are important, what features haven't we gotten to yet, and what are sort of the wants and needs of both the field and individuals who might use these devices.
So do you have certain types of students that help in your lab? Are they speech students? Are they From neuroscience? Do you have a mix?
Yes. We did a count at the beginning of this semester, and there were, I think, either 17 or 18 students in my lab now.
Wow.
13 of them are at the undergraduate level.
Okay.
I have speech students, I have linguistics, I've had math. I currently have 2 computer science students, a couple of psychology students, some neuroscience students, all from the undergraduate side. I've had electrical engineers and computer engineers in the past who have since graduated. And over my time here at KU, I've had 4 PhD students that I've directly worked with and another who I've worked with in a secondary role. And they've spanned neuroscience, speech pathology, psychology, and electrical engineering. So it is a very interdisciplinary lab. I'm also part of the bioengineering program, and I work with senior design teams in both mechanical, bioengineering, and electrical, computer science to really do our stuff.
Great experience for the students.
It's an amazing experience, and so it's actually a remarkable experience for some students who have never sort of thought about working with people in this way. And so just speaking from my own experience as an undergraduate computer science student, like, I didn't work with people. I worked in like my dark room in the middle of the night writing code for things that weren't going to ever see the light of day, but were about understanding how computer science works. Mm-hmm. That first experience of working with someone who cannot move and is reliant on this technology, or might be reliant on this technology, is really a powerful experience. And really any student can gain from that experience, but I really think engineering students and computer science students can gain from it because it puts their work in perspective. Mm-hmm. And it sees what the end goal of their work could be and has a different sort of drive or push for completing the certain types of work that they do, or it might actually give them an idea of, well, maybe I don't just want to be some software engineer, which is a great profession, it's highly sought after, mm-hmm. but maybe I want to do something that is a little bit outside those normal trajectories for folks in my career and move towards biomedical or rehabilitation or anything like that, because technology is just a huge aspect of our lives now.
Sure.
And that's just another direction they can go in. The flip side is that speech students can absolutely gain from this experience as well. I mean, they're going to be more likely to be involved with individuals with complex communication needs, motor needs throughout their careers, and being introduced to that as early as possible is always a great idea. But then they get introduced to technology in a way they might not have before, and it makes that familiarity with advanced technology that might be used in their careers that much more important, that much more present, and hopefully make them early adopters of our work later on when it finally becomes available.
Fantastic. Well, when you're talking about this topic, I know you were recently invited to the 2019 meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in Washington, D.C., mm-hmm. and you presented Talking Without Speaking, Transcending Communication Boundaries with Technology. Could you share a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so this was a really interesting experience. It was sort of initiated by ASHA, the American Speech Language Hearing Association. They reached out to a couple of people, and fortunately that included me. It also included Kathy Binger and Amy Dietz, who are experts in augmentative alternative communication in different populations, in children and language learning, and then in stroke, like acquired stroke, so you're in adults. And we each presented on really different things, but as we were talking, it was really interesting. We all kind of came up with this idea that we're actually saying the same thing in different ways. And the idea is that we all do technology, which is really important, but it's not the only thing. And the technology is a piece of the puzzle, but training or instruction on that technology is important, and then personalization. So every individual is very different. I was just at another conference where we talked about the benefit of randomized control trials, which is amazing benefit and must be done for efficacy of treatments. But in our populations that we work with, the numbers are so small, and each individual is honestly so different from the other, and their environments and their training needs are different, that this personalized approach is really a hallmark of the type of work that we do. Mm-hmm. The other aspect of that meeting that was amazing is that they have a family science day, and so I actually volunteered at the ASHA booth for like half a day and got to interact with kids, adults of all ages for a whole day, just telling them about like speech stuff, mm-hmm. which was really exciting. Just to see these like 8, 9, 10-year-olds figuring out things that I'm talking about, figuring out things about speech motor control just through experience was this really remarkable and enriching experience, and I hope I get to do it again at some point, and I hope students have that opportunity as well.
You're starting to recruit for our program a little early, but okay, I like it, I like it. So with all the research that you've been doing, do you have something in mind that you want to develop in the future, or a burning question you just really want to answer?
The burning question, I would love, like our work is intended, so I have recently got a new grant, and it's to develop an artificial vocal tract for people with paralysis that is brain controlled. Mm-hmm. And right now we're at the beginning stages of that. And honestly, what I would love nothing more than for our technology to eventually be a replacement for your vocal tract. I mean, you can put one of these, it doesn't work this way now, but you could conceive of it fitting on your phone, and if you had enough sensors and if you had enough technology, you could really interpret what your speech motor commands are and have someone who can't speak for one reason or another be able to be fluently speaking through this artificial device. We're really at the beginning stages of that now, and that's what this grant is all about, is sort of starting that process. But if you could do that, I mean, then you would have this remarkable ability to ensure communication is available throughout the lifespan.
Wow.
And particularly, I'm getting very interested in younger populations. BCI, brain-computer interface, is focused almost entirely on adult populations who absolutely need a voice. That, more often than not, it's an acquired disorder, and so there's a lot of really important life and medical decisions that need to be made. And if you have a voice, you have agency in that as the individual who is being talked about.
Sure.
So that's an important thing. But almost left in the dust, because we just don't know enough about them, are kids. And there are so many kids whose needs aren't being met by current AAC technology or applications, that moving to a brain-based approach and providing these children who are in this critical period of learning things. We go from being infants to toddlers to adolescents and stuff without knowing anything about how anything works, and yet we all figure it out. And so adding in this brain-computer interface component will just be another thing that they don't know anything about. And as long as it is a reliable device, it doesn't even have to be right. It just has to be reliable. It has to be right a little bit, but but it has to be reliable. But if it is, then kids can learn how to do this. And so there's an amazing sense of promise that I see when considering applications for children and growing, developing children.
Very neat. I've heard that you've done some cool things framing your speech perception class in order to help students read research articles. Can you talk about that?
So this is a class of speech perception, and half the class is learning or in most cases relearning. Some of these students, they're typically audiology students, although there's some SLP, Ph.D, and master students in there. They maybe haven't had this information in a number of years, and so there's a refresher. But then after that, it's applying basic knowledge about speech processes to current issues in clinical practice or clinical research papers that are being published. And I was just having this discussion with the class this year of how they've gotten so far in their curriculum, and everything is very prescribed. They're going off to be clinical professionals. They have to make decisions. They have to rely on evidence. They have to be able to synthesize that in a very short amount of time. And so there isn't time to think. And in our class, I encourage them to forget all that stuff and really just think about the problem and think about what they know and how it applies to these research articles. Maybe not even decide if the research article was a good one or a bad one, or if the result was good or the result was bad, but how does that article fit within their lives, and how can they apply that basic knowledge, which they all have, but kind of put in the back seat in favor of clinical processes, to understanding more about the topic and being open to talking about the topic, how it influences their lives, and maybe how it already exists in their clinical careers, such that they are at that early stage.
Sure. Well, very neat. That seems pretty practical.
I think so. I mean, I hope so. And this is a lot of, maybe this is part of the philosophy side that I was introduced to at such a young age, but always being willing to think about something and always being willing to talk about it and analyze it from a point of view that is important for both you and others, I think is something that is always worth pursuing, especially if you're in a clinical environment. People are people, and you make decisions, but it's important to know why you're making that decision. And sometimes, I do this absolutely. As a programmer, I forget why I do things. I just do them. And the same thing happens I feel, in many professions, where you sometimes forget why you're doing something and you just do it because you've done it for so long. And hopefully this experience gives students an ability to sort of reflect in that introspective way on their experience.
Right. What would you say has been your most memorable accomplishment within your career?
I think, and I've been thinking about this a little bit. You and I have talked a little about the podcast, and so I was trying to, come up with some ideas here. And it's easy to say something about technology and how it's super cool. And I always run myself on our stuff so I should say that all of our research is non-invasive at KU, and so it means I just put on an EEG cap and run myself, and it's super fun. Fully knowing that some people might actually need to use this for their communication. And so I moved away from thinking about technology here, and honestly, it's the interaction with our participants. Many of these participants have ALS, and they know what that means for their future, and yet they are willing and interested and excited to come and work with us, to knowing that our research is probably not going to help them in the time that they have left remaining, knowing that that information might be helpful to someone else in the future. And being around people like that, A, puts your own life in perspective,
Sure.
But B, really puts you understand something about other people who really just want to help and want to be involved in the process that they have this unique personal experience with. And it's hopefully a positive in their life in the context of so many other complex things that are happening with them. And hopefully the same thing happens. We're about to start a study with teenagers with a very specific type of cerebral palsy, and I hope we get the same experience out of that as well.
Do you have a hard time finding participants? Are you always recruiting, or?
We are always recruiting, and fortunately, so this is one of the big benefits of KU. We have both Lawrence, we have the Med Center, we're large metropolitan areas, and we have a fantastic ALS clinic. And so we've been able to partner with the clinic for almost as long as I've been here. So we don't have a shortage of individuals who are interested in our study. We currently have a lack of capacity for running more participants than we currently enroll, which is good because we have a lot of different aspects to our studies that we need to investigate, and doing this in a piecemeal manner, I think, ensures that we won't miss something along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's lighten it up a little bit now that we've had all this sad talk, but excellent discussion. Do you have any favorite podcasts or blogs, YouTube channels, or anything to which you subscribe?
So I just started listening to the new David Tennant podcast. It's basically him just interviewing people he knows, and it ends up going into acting and like their experiences with acting. You just get to hear it in different aspects of their lives. So I just started listening to that. What I honestly do most of the time is I listen to clips of or watch clips of SNL and Colbert whenever I can. Typically, this is silently as my children are trying to fall asleep and they need to see my feet or something like that. And so I'm just out of eye line while silently laughing to Colbert.
So what's it like being a dad of two young children and working full time?
It's exhausting. It's like, as many parents know, it's a full-time job on top of like another full-time job, and it might even be two full-time jobs on top of that.
Right.
But in the context of sort of my life, it's really given me a new opportunity to focus. It's given me a great ability to compartmentalize and to make sure I make the most of my time. So I try to make the most of my time at work, and I try to make the most of my time for my kids and my family at home. We have two very rambunctious large dogs as well, and so they're like another, two kids who need attention. And so being able to be present for them, and I think they've given me a really good ability there.
Great. So what is something that your students would be surprised to know about you? And I know you mentioned your interest in sci-fi and futuristic things earlier, so I kind of have a feeling about this one.
Well, so, and I would think that none of my students would be very surprised that I'm a huge sci-fi fan. So one of the podcasts I actually did just start listening to was the Battlestar Galacticast, which is probably the nerdiest thing I've ever said out loud.
And now everyone will know.
That's right. And so it's fun. It's actually a really cool show that happened to be set in space. But anyway, so I don't think that's actually surprising. I think people will probably know that about me, or maybe make an assumption based on the comments I make in class. Maybe a little bit more surprising is that I like to bake. I've had a tradition for a number of years of baking cinnamon rolls on Christmas. Whenever I get the chance, I do like to make sort of yeasty things. So I made bagels for a really long time. You asked about the kids before. I haven't made bagels in a while. It's a lot easier to go out and buy them.
Sure.
But doing things like that, it engages both, I feel, in a sense, creative side. I almost, going way back to some of your first questions, I was almost a chemist. I was out of high school. I thought I was going to be a chemistry, maybe a chemical engineer. Baking in this way sort of scratches that itch as well, because baking, as opposed to cooking, is very much a scientific thing. It's a very much like if you change the amount of baking powder versus baking soda, you get totally something different.
It's going to sink in.
Exactly. So that is something that I enjoy doing, and I've been able to do a little bit more of it lately, so that's sort of fun.
Well, that surprises me, but now I know for when we have intercampus departmental meetings, we're going to ask you to be the baker.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. Well, Jon, thank you for joining us today and sharing your knowledge on speech and neuroscience and the plethora of experience you've already had in it. It sounds like there's so many wonderful advances that you and your lab are making, so thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much. It's been super fun talking about this stuff, and I can't wait to hear more of them.
You bet. To our listeners, that was Dr. Jon Brumberg, Assistant Professor in the Intracampus Program in Communicative Disorders at the University of Kansas. Thank you for listening, and rock chalk.